Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here. We'll start right away and then we wait for more people to join in. You're very welcome to this side event on ensuring accountability for gender transformative climate action. And we're going to focus on from CSW66 to us here at COP27. And we have our panelists that will discuss some of the ways in which sexual reproductive health and rights interlink with climate change and the climate crisis, and why it is essential that we incorporate the advocacy for the inclusion of sexual reproductive health and rights in all our climate advocacy work for resilience as well as adaptation. And we're going to look at discussing the conclusions from the Commission on the Status of Women, and then leading up here to COP27 to see how that can be incorporated. So I have with me a lineup of amazing panelists from different backgrounds. We are people comprising of gender and climate activists, sexual reproductive health and rights experts, and we have people also from the front line that are going to share experiences and also some of the knowledge and research results on how we can all promote gender transformative action, climate action. So quickly going into a brief round of introduction, and maybe I'll just go in the order in which I can see you right here. So I have by my right, Ili Nadia Zulfaka. Welcome, Nadia. So Nadia is an eco-feminist and a co-founder of a program director of KAMY, K-A-M-Y, which is a climate justice and feminist organization led by young people in Malaysia, which is basically to strengthen the ecosystem of climate justice and climate governance in Malaysia, and also through research, lobbying, and civil society empowerment for a just and peaceful transition. Nadia is also a consultant that is working in climate policy and risk and business and human rights, with experience in several local think tanks and international institutions like ICIS Malaysia, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, European Climate Foundation, and the likes. So moving on from Nadia, I have Amalia. Amalia is a social environment activist, 19 years old, a physics student at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and an activist in the Friday for the Future movement, working locally, nationally, and internationally. And Amalia's activism is focused on social and climate justice, showing how social and climate issues are interconnected and present in everyone's daily lives. She started protesting in 2019 and has helped structure Friday for the Future in Brazil, both locally and nationally, and also other various protests and campaigns around climate and social justice. And in 2020, Amalia helped to Indigenous community in the Amazon to deal with COVID-19 pandemic, and she co-founded SOS Amazonia campaign, which continues until this day. And in 2021, Amalia attended COP26, where she participated in meetings, protests, and also some of the activities where she helped organize protests in her local community, and co-created Desenrola, which is an uncomplicated media outlet accessible to youth and the general public. Moving on, next is Mia Nielsen, who is a climate advisor at the Danish Family Planning Association. Mia manages projects and advocacy initiatives between operatives within the interlinkages between sexual reproductive health and rights and climate change. Also, we have on our panelist, Biblapi Shrestha, Program Director for Asian Pacific Resources and Research Center for Women, ARROW. Biblapi is a program director, and she leads multi-country programs of ARROW that includes advocacy work around climate change and climate justice, embedding gender equality and SRHR. And lastly, but not the least, we have Tara Daniel. Tara Daniel is a senior program manager with the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. and Tara leads Widow's portfolio of of work on feminist climate finance, supporting women's participation in the climate negotiation, and advocates for gender-responsive climate policies. Also, you have me. I'm going to be moderating this session today, and my name is Zainab Yunusa, and I'm a climate justice advocate for women's and girls' rights. I'm also a member of the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC, and most of my advocacy work is strengthening research and policy, and also trying to advance gender-transformative policies, which is why we are here today for this interesting discussion and debate. And moving straight on, I'd like to start, so we'll pose a couple of questions to hear panelists' views on the topic that we're talking about today, and then we'll also have a session where we'd like to hear contributions from the audiences, as well as questions that you find interesting, and from there we'll just see where the conversation leads us. So I would like to begin with Tara. And Tara, we know earlier this year the CSW, Commission on Status of Women, happened. We saw the agreed conclusion. We knew within the months that followed up until COP27 that we are here, we knew that we needed to make some action, some advocacy concerning the issue of gender equality. And so what I'd just like you to share with us is we've seen some of the work that WIDO is doing on behalf of the Women and Gender constituency and also the SRHR Climate Change Justice Coalition. So what is happening in terms of the perspective of the coalition and the lead up from CSW up until here? Where are we, in fact, in terms of agreement that has to do with gender and also maybe SRHR a bit?
Thanks so much, Zainab. I'm so glad to be here representing, in part, the Women and Gender constituency, as well as the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition, and to have been a part of the amazing advocacy that has happened throughout this year, and the energy and the attention in various collective feminist spaces that has gone towards the advocacy that is absolutely necessary and fundamental to recognize these interlinkages between SRHR and climate justice. And unfortunately, as I'll speak about in a few minutes, we are at a position at this particular COP where that call has not fully been heard. But I want to set the stage a little bit more broadly first. And recognize that we know that we're in this moment where the imperative of sexual and reproductive health and rights as fundamental human rights, as essential to well-being, has been highlighted in part by the denial and the restriction and the lack of access to those rights in places around the world, and the disastrous, heartbreaking consequences and the suffering caused by that denial. Which of course is very much interlinked and compounded by the impacts of climate change. Equally, we are seeing this greater understanding that SRHR and climate change are interlinked, but within that general appreciation, the nature of these interlinkages is not often fully detailed. And that's part of why it's so valuable to have the work of so many of my colleagues on this stage shared, and as part of a coalition that launched last year to ensure that we are sharing knowledge, that we are breaking down silos, and that we are crafting and working on collective messages and advocacy in this space. So the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition is a coalition of more than 50 organizations and growing that have come together under shared terms of reference. And we're a place for organizations to have conversations about these connections, to share research and promising practices, and to advocate for the policies and approaches necessary to address the interlinkages of SRHR and climate justice. And as a coalition, we do have these aims that speak to this larger work of promoting SRHR and climate adaptation and resilience, regardless of whether or not you are part of the coalition or just following our work. So we do hope to identify gaps in research and programs and funding and services, and to generate and disseminate new evidence to relevant stakeholders. We currently create collective policy recommendations, including at CSW, to influence these key climate and SRHR advocacy spaces and international conferences. Also here, of course, and then the upcoming International Conference on Family Planning. So we want to see this integration in climate policies and programs and financing mechanisms. We want policymakers and healthcare providers to include the impact of the climate crisis on SRHR and to recognize the imperative of equitable access to healthcare in planning and programming. And as we're continuing to really build our strength as a coalition that just launched last year and our work in collective, we will be designing campaigns and advocacy strategies in partnership with feminist, Indigenous, youth, and grassroots movements. We already have organizations from over 30 countries represented as part of this work. And we know that we have to situate our area of concern, sexual and reproductive health, within this bigger vision of a healthier and more equitable world. And so ultimately we promote collaborative exchange and learning opportunities. And so we're really glad to be here with you today to strengthen our collaborative approaches and to recognize that our work, of course, is guided by 5 key principles: human rights, bodily autonomy, intersectionality, justice, and inclusive organizing. And so that brings us to where we are at this moment at COP27. And we came into this space with an update of a material that the Danish Family Planning Association started last year, and it's available on our coalition website under our coalition resources. And this documents a walkthrough of the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, also known as the GAP, which is the document that outlines key actions to support gender-responsive climate action as a part of the convention. So the GAP, which was envisioned as a 5-year document, was adopted back at COP25 in 2019, doesn't mention SRHR. For health, it really only reiterates the right to health that's part of the human rights that were elaborated in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. But this document is all about gender-responsive climate action, or was supposed to be, and it's a call for parties and for relevant organizations to undertake and contribute to certain activities to advance gender equality and climate action. So we've mapped out the 18 activities in the primary areas of the GAP, excluding the monitoring and reporting function that the Secretariat leads on, to really highlight within those key activities how parties and relevant organizations can ensure an SRHR lens in their implementation, to know that it's not gender-responsive climate action if SRHR is not fundamentally integrated as part of those policies and programming. And this has become incredibly important, specifically when we consider the failure of the GAP negotiations here at this COP. And the Women and Gender constituency, which has a lot of overlap in members with the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition, and which is aligned on our approaches on SRHR. We worked on a joint advocacy brief for COP26, much of which still holds incredible relevance for the messages that we hope our policymakers will be listening to. The Women and Gender constituency has put out a statement about the disappointment with the so-called review of the GAP that happened, and that didn't focus on the experiences of women and girls on the front lines of climate change. And it didn't create space for recognizing even health in the GAP activities, despite a specific ask from the Women and Gender constituency to do so, despite also other organizing happenings such as the African Feminist Task Force and their amazing 27 collective demands for action here at COP, also recognizing and calling for the recognition of SRHR within gender-responsive climate action. So as we think about where we are, coming from the CSW this year to this particular moment, we know that the next step that we have in this policy space that didn't pick up all of the ways in which CSW did recognize SRHR and climate justice is to turn our focus on what we can do as a collective to continuing to promote these messages of rights-based, gender-responsive climate action, but to ensure that the implementation that we know is happening by so many feminists and so many women's rights organizations on the ground is ultimately recognized and supported and scaled and practiced and in domestic policy, turning to the implementation that should be happening under the convention. And we hope really as a new coalition that we can work to bring more attention to the messages, the calls for action, the stories and examples, the evidence and the materials and the resources of local community groups working at this intersection and seeking to strengthen their work at this intersection in our collective advocacy so that we can really fight for the recognition and the value that SRHR deserves as part of creating a health and just world.
Thank you very much, Tara, for that very insightful information on the work of the Women and Gender constituency as well as the SRHR coalition. And just to add to the point that you mentioned about the importance of collective advocacy and how unfortunately the call for SRHR was not fulfilled in the gender negotiations that we've been following. Also to highlight the importance of the demands of the African Feminist Task Force that was shared, like you say, 27 demands. And very importantly, one of the demands was on intersectionality and linkages to other work, because one of the things we felt was that if there is no, in as much as sexual reproductive health right issues, gender is cross-cutting, if it is not acknowledged in some of the actions, in some of the decisions at COP27, in subsequent negotiations, that we might not be moving in any direction whatsoever. And then moving from Tara over to you, Mia. The title of our conversation here is saying from CSW66 to COP27. We know that earlier this year, the Commission on the Status of Women, which is CSW, the 66th session, for the first time really agreed to conclusions that specifically was on women's empowerment, climate change, disaster risk reduction. So we really, if you could just amplify what really happened at the CSW and how can that inform our conversations going forward to COP27? We know that the Gender Action Plan didn't really go as we wanted, but then we will not stop advocating, we will not stop our collective demands as feminists. So what really happened at CSW and what can we take on that to COP27 and moving forward?
Thank you so much, Zainab. Let me just start out with very briefly just introducing the organization that I work for, because as Zainab said, I work for the Danish Family Planning Association, which is also known as the DFPA. Our mission is to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights all over the world. And the reason why we started engaging in the climate agenda is because we saw, and unfortunately are still seeing to an even higher degree, the devastating consequences that the climate crisis has on SRHR. And that's when we started exploring and addressing the interlinkages between the climate crisis and SRHR. I also want to mention that we are members of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, known as IPPF. And the reason why I want to also highlight them today is because I'm going to talk, as Zainab said, a little bit more in detail about CSW. And DFPA was standing side by side together with IPPF at CSW. And in fact, I want to share some important sentences with you from IPPF's new draft strategy for the coming period, because I feel like these words really set the tone really well for what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, IPPF writes that they recognize the climate crisis as one of the key challenges of our time, with the deepening and devastating impacts felt across countries. Secondly, IPPF highlight the interconnectedness between struggles for human rights, climate survival, social justice, and equality. And third and last, IPPF commit themselves and its partners to deliver effective cross-sector campaigns, positioning common agendas and priorities on intersecting issues such as climate change, gender equality, and universal health coverage over the next strategy period. And I just think these words sets a perfect frame for me to elaborate a bit more on this year's CSW. Because as Zainab also said, the 67th session on the Commission on the Status of Women, which is known as CSW, is actually kind of groundbreaking, because it is the first time in the history of the Commission that we reached an agreement on gender and climate. And this agreement creates an important opportunity for future discussions on this topic in other intergovernmental spaces, such as the COP. But it also ensures that the international community really realize and acknowledge the interlinkages between gender equality and the climate crisis, and therefore makes commitments to address them. But I also want to say that while this is groundbreaking, the CSW agreement also falls short, as it is not as ambitious as many of us as civil society organizations had advocated for. But they did reach some important milestones that have the potential to advance intergovernmental discussions going forward. So IPPF and GFPA, we had 3 key advocacy points at the CSW, and we wanted the agreement to ensure 3 things. We wanted it to ensure the interlinkages between climate change and SRHR, meaning that the realization of SRHR is really critical in terms of climate adaptation and climate resilience. Second of all, the prioritization of gender-responsive climate action was also one of our key advocacy points. And third and last, the full, meaningful, and effective participation of civil society, girls, women, and other marginalized groups when it comes to climate decisions affecting their lives the most. And in fact, many of these priorities made their way into the agreement itself that was adopted at the CSW. For example, the agreed conclusion for the first time ever called for sexual and reproductive health issues to be taken into consideration when taking action to address climate change. And the agreement also explicitly calls on member states to increase gender-responsive investment in climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, and the gender-responsive just transitions, as well as it recognizes the key role and contribution from civil society organizations and actors. So with all of this being said, what does the CSW agreement mean in practice? The inclusion of SRHR in the CSW agreement recognizes that the climate crisis does in fact affect the realizations of the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Furthermore, fulfilling SRHR also supports and strengthens people's abilities to be climate resilient and adapt to climate changes. So practically, what we're asking for and what this CSW agreement means for the different states is that governments should, for example, integrate SRHR into national climate policies and programs, this meaning national determined contribution, national action plans and gender action plans. It also means that they need to ensure the allocation of adequate resources and also engage girls, women, youth in the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of gender-responsive, rights-based policies and programs. So here at COP27, Tara has already spoiled a little bit about the situation right now on gender negotiations, but it's also important to look at beyond this COP. So looking forward at this COP and beyond this COP, we must remind decision makers of the gains that were actually made at CSW and try to build upon those achievements. It is critical that in the same way the UN gender negotiations integrate climate consideration into their work, the COP also needs to integrate gender consideration into its work in a way that is meaningful and makes the difference for global agreements on addressing the climate crisis, as well as for the lives of women, girls, and marginalized groups who are the ones that are most affected by the climate crisis in terms of their rights, their livelihoods, and their future. And with that, I want to give the word back to you, Zainab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. Thank you for reminding us of the gains of the CSW and how it's important and why we should continue to push and advocate for that in, COP27, subsequent COPs coming. And I'll quickly then move over to you, Biplapi. We've heard about CSW66, the gains made there. We've heard from Tara, the journey so far, and the advocacy. But you know, in our advocacy work and all that we do, even amongst us climate justice advocates, there are still these questions about how exactly does SRHR link to the climate crisis? what are these linkages? What are the evidences? Are we just moving around and saying, maybe trying to just link problems to climate change? But the truth is that there are real life practical impacts of climate change on SRHR, on the meeting of the needs of the rights of women and girls in their diversities. So I just would like you to share on some of the impacts of climate change on SRHR, but we specifically want to look at the Asian context, which is where you cover. Could you just tell us what is going on? What are the ways that climate change has impacted the sexual reproductive health and rights of your work?
Thank you, Zainab. Can you hear me? First of all, thank you all for choosing to be with us. I know that there are a lot of overlapping events that are happening, but this is also an equally important conversations, and thank you so much for being with us. Before I start with to answer the question that Zainab has asked, just for all of you who are new to ARROW, the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, we are a regional feminist organization, and we are working to advance women, young people, and gender non-binary people's sexual and reproductive health and rights, and also its intersections with other issues, and climate change is one of them. So like, as Tara and also as Mia were saying, that ARROW is also very heavily engaged in CSW process. But again, like, we really need to understand what really these interlinkages are, right? As part of my presentation today, I'm actually very happy to present this advocacy brief that you see on the screen. That is the culmination of 2 sub-regional consultations that ARROW convened with CSOs from South and Southeast Asia in the lead up to COP27. And the CSOs who were part of this consultation, they work on the issues of climate change, gender, SRHR, and its intersections with other issues. And they actually identify diverse identities, including but not limited to marginalized women, gender non-binary community, young people, women with disabilities, and indigenous peoples. So the CSOs, we came together, we discussed and defined our regional priorities on the intersections of climate change, gender, and SRHR, with an aim to demand accountability from the decision makers. And this is, again, not just at COP, also beyond COP, also including at the national level to put forth our recommendations. And so just a little bit of a background in the region. The Asia-Pacific region is at the forefront of experiencing the impact of climate change and its related disasters. And according to the Global Risk Report assessments, many countries in the region are located at the top of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And according to the estimates by UNESCAP, Asia-Pacific Disaster Report in 2019, the Asia-Pacific region has its annual loss of 675 billion due to climate-induced disasters. And the ramifications of climate change, we all know, are like, also on the impact of food security, and it trigger conflicts over key resources such as arable land, water, food, and energy sources. So as has already been discussed, like, the interlinkages is, it's like, we have enough evidences to prove that these are inextricably linked. And the context of this intersection is not any different in this region also. Like, there are examples from different regions. So, like, it's very similar in Asia region as well. The SRHR, especially women and girls and gender non-binary people, it gets further deteriorated due to deprioritization during humanitarian crisis, despite they are being, despite the inextricable interlinkages that we are talking about. And though our countries have made commitments to key international instruments, agreements such as, like, the CEDAW, CRPD, ICPD, Beijing, and SDGs to ensure gender mainstreaming in policy frameworks and the implementation of Gender Action Plan on climate change, the effects are not reflected in the national policies and programs. And moreover, what we also experience is that the voices from the region are disproportional, and representation at various global platforms are also limited. So I'm just here going to, share a few examples of, and also to unpack a few of the examples of these interlinkages. But again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many more examples. So one is there's a lack of comprehensive sexuality education, access to comprehensive sexuality education. though there have been systemic efforts to implement CSE in many countries in the region, there are still barriers and challenges to implement it in curriculum due to cultural norms and stigma. And this becomes worse in the context of climate disaster for young people, especially girls in the region, who lose access to schools or access to education. And we have examples from countries where parents withdraw their daughters from school so that they could either help out at home or on the farm, or to find a job to supplement the household's income due to the increasing economic hardship experienced by the family due to disasters. And this has in turn limited their access to education, including comprehensive sexuality education. And as Indigenous women and girls are at high risk of climate change impacts, their access to CSE is also further challenged. Therefore, community-targeted CSE needs to be promoted. Second, the effects of climate change are also an indirect driver of child marriage, despite that it has been recognized as a harmful practice. When extreme weather events destroy livelihoods, the financial distress of local communities and families can lead them to consider marrying girl children as a coping strategy. And our partners in the region have also found in their studies that families are practicing child marriage among their young daughters as a means to escape poverty brought about by climate crisis. And marriage in early stage increase the risk of early pregnancy, which makes the girls more susceptible to reproductive health complications. And third, what we find in this in the studies that we have done is so that there is zero or limited access to SRHR services during climate disasters. And this is also because climate disaster induce vital disintegration of vital infrastructures. And especially for women and girls who are displaced and living in humanitarian settings, lack of access to SR services is the leading cause of death. And disaster hit girls and women harder over the immediate and long term, as they are often poorer than men and yet may have larger burden of care. And there are some examples from countries which I'm not going to share here, but you can read it in the report that I've shared on the screen as well. Also, what we have also seen is that these are also the results of exclusion of marginalized communities and their lived realities in decision-making processes, including at spaces like COP. That's what we have been experiencing as well. We also, and this is something that has been discussed by the previous speakers also, that there's limited mention of gender and complete exclusion of SRHR. There are, so some of the recommendations for the parties as we are at COP, and we still hope that there are some spaces for us, is that, all the conversations of climate at COP and outcomes should have an intersectional, equitable lens and a human rights-based approach. This also means applying human rights, gender, and social justice-based approach to climate action that includes full range of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and to commit to robust and feminist financing for climate and SRHR intersections. The parties must also implement their commitments to gender equality and uphold SRHR when responding to the climate crisis. And they should ensure inclusive and meaningful participation of the most affected and marginalized communities in decision related to climate change at all levels of planning, development, implementation, and monitoring processes. Parties must also prioritize climate-resilient health systems that ensure SRH services in times of crisis. And the decisions at COP, it must reflect demands of the progressive CSOs with grassroots-specific knowledge that can contribute to gender analysis and policy development. And the parties must also address the structural barriers embedded in norms, laws, and policies pertaining to SRHR that contribute to inequality and injustice. And what we are seeing is also the silos in the processes. There's no integration of learning from CSW here, so we actually hope that those silos are broken and that there are synergies in the processes, different processes, be it at the global level or regional level, so that we are looking towards a comprehensive and holistic solution to climate solution that is not possible without the integration of sexual and reproductive health and rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biplapi. Some of the impacts that I hear you mention is things like the disruption to access of sexual reproductive health rights services. We're seeing cases of increased risk of forced early marriages and unions amongst especially among girl children. We're seeing the lack of comprehensive sexuality education. We're seeing the stigma, the norms, cultural norms that exist, and we're seeing some of all of these impacts that then take us backwards to the state of gender inequality that we already have, and why we're insisting that gender transformative actions is essential in what we're saying to climate action. So then moving on to Nadia. Nadia, we've heard from Biblapi some of the impacts of climate change. So I just would really like you to touch on climate change, gender, SRHR from indigenous communities. You're from Malaysia. You work, your advocacy work focuses on this area. So perhaps you could share for us some of your experiences with the intersection.
Hi, thank you so much. Maybe I can just start off with a bit of some few personal stories from my end as a grassroots organizer. A year before COVID-19 started, I got a call from a head of indigenous village in rural Malaysia at the northern part of Peninsula, and he told me that, hey, can you come in? 12 of our indigenous indigenous villages are dead. And he said that it could potentially have something to do with the water that is their source of livelihood, and he thinks that it's polluted. So I got into a jeep and we traveled up north into a highly militarized zone to pick up water samples, and we were harassed all of the way through, and got back into the lab and do the water analysis. And the analysis that we found that the water was highly polluted, but the government does not want to take our analysis as an official account of what happened in that area. So within that 12 people who died, I think around 6 people are women. That is one of the story, and there's also another story where which probably I will I'll tell a bit later, but it shows so much that when we want to talk about indigenous women, we have to tie it back to the land and the crisis of native land rights of indigenous people are not being, their rights are not being recognized in many regions in developing countries where there are still swathes of rainforest available. And there was a time where there was a community that I was working with who's calling me up because she needs a legal fund to do a bit of a medical checkup, partly because she thinks that her communities have been given contraceptive shots without their consent in a state affair to control populations of the indigenous people in that particular conflict area. So these are the kind of intimidations that rural indigenous women face, and I do not think that I want to be here to speak on behalf of them, because there will be this kind of information. You can find it at the Indigenous Pavilion, but some of the things that I perhaps can share is that when it comes back to issues of climate change, we go back to the issues of land degradation, lands being dispossessed from these people, and it's a highly structural problems that governments refuse to address, even at the negotiation tables when they speak about solutions, false solutions, which does not have the kind of safeguards that is needed to protect these marginalized communities. So I wanted to share also a story about this one community that I was doing some consultations for, where the lands are completely degraded. They were being dispossessed and they were living in lands that was given by the government to compensate the loss of their customary land. And these lands are completely void of fertile soil that would enable the woman to cultivate for food. So one, if they don't have land, they can't cultivate for food. And most of the farmers are normally women. They are the ones who keep the seeds. They are the ones who do the harvesting. So in that way, they will also lose sources of income, independent sources of income. So they would have to rely on their family members, and that not having financial independence is absolutely a big problem when we see across rural indigenous communities. And in Malaysia as well, Malaysia has recently signed up to a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with the United States, where it says that heritage seeds are not allowed to be planted by farmers. That would mean all these heirloom seeds passed down from generation to generation can't be planted, or else you'll be fined. It goes under penal code. You have to pay so much money, in order. It comes with a lot of punishment. So this is also another form of intimidation where women can't cultivate their rights. They will lose income and they will be financially not independent. And I think I already spoke a bit about the indigenous community, but where I'm from, I come from a very urban community, and every now and then I try to do some bit of research of how the urban poor women and families, how they are facing this crisis. So there was actually a study that I was very briefly involved in, whereby they collect information from young girls living in urban poor area and how their lives are being impacted by the floods and by the heat waves. So what they told us, these young girls, what they told us is that whenever there's a flood or heat waves, they are locked in their houses. So they will be cramped with all the extended family members, and where they will feel really scared. So there's a high risk of sexual violence for young women, young girls, and the way that, and we think this is totally underreported, partly because whenever we want to interview parents, we want to interview young girls, you have to get the parents to be there in the room as well. So you can't get the necessary information because of them being scared in sharing this information, they being confused of what it meant. So there's a lot of gaps and challenges that we see in the society, either through the structural norms or even the way how we do research. So those are the kind of things that I saw across the community that I lived in. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia, for sharing some of those lived experiences around the impact of climate change to gender in the region that you work for. And I strongly also want to just reiterate what you said about false solution that does not protect marginalized group, and how you brought up this narrative that always comes up when we're talking about sexual reproductive health and rights and climate action, the population control narrative, which is really dangerous and harmful, which sort of at the end of the day, what we see is that the burden of climate crisis is then placed on this already marginalized group of women, mostly in African regions. You're saying that more people on the planet means more gas emissions, and we know that is not even scientifically true with the research, because we see the high-income countries producing gas emissions that's not comparable to the low-income African countries, for instance. And so it is just an unjust, fair narrative, one that we need to always debunk whenever we are in spaces like this talking about sexual reproductive health and rights. And I also then agree with you when you're talking about how this increases the incidence of sexual and gender-based violence. And I know that recently Plan International also released this research report talking with girls in Zambia and Zimbabwe. And what the research found out is that how climate change heavily impacts their education, mainly through child, early and forced marriage unions, because some of the interviews that were done, we see where girls are talking about how they've been forced into early child marriages because of the financial stress that families are experiencing, and then they think, one less mouth to feed. Maybe when we push out some of these girls into some of these unions, we either get money in exchange, or then, they're just out of the picture completely. And so these are some of the ways when we talk about sexual reproductive rights. This is now more on the rights aspect, talking about how this is a fundamental human right, that you are a human being at all, and why these must be incorporated in any of the climate action we're talking about as it affects girls and women in their diversity. And so moving on to you, Amelia, we've heard a lot, we've seen, conversation around this, and I just want you to really share with us how you think that the key roles that you think women can play in climate action, in position. I mean, you've worked in the context of Latin America, so some of the access to basic hygiene products, education, like Nadia have mentioned. What do you think? What do you think can change in this context? And then, if you still have time to touch on, what does the new government in Brazil, does it mean anything at all for gender justice?
Yeah, I think we actually have a lot of similar points that we want to talk about, and that's very interesting. I am a social and climate activist in Brazil, and I'm guided by the notion that we need intersectional climate justice, and that for us obviously means gender justice. One cannot exist without the other. And I think for a lot of us that are from the MAPA, from the most affected people and areas, we have known that gender justice means climate justice for a long time, because we see the connections in these issues every single day in our communities, in our countries, and in our regions. Brazil, the country where I am from, is extremely behind in terms of sexual reproductive rights. Simultaneously, it is extremely affected by the climate crisis. Severe fires, floods, and droughts have been happening all around Brazil simultaneously. For example, while we have droughts in my region, we have extreme floods in other regions. And so this shows how extreme this is, because such close places are happening, like disasters really are happening. Women, particularly in peripheral regions, by that I mean favelas, for example, in an urban context, or in quilombola and traditional communities, are all a lot more affected by these issues. These women usually also are the ones that run households. They are responsible for families, for communities. They are responsible for sharing and creating a space for people to live in these communities. And when they do not have access to menstrual hygiene products, for example, but even basic education on sexual and reproductive rights, they are endangered, especially when they have to deal also with these extreme weather events. With regions such as the Northeast in Brazil, and I believe this happens also in a lot of other regions in the world, extreme droughts are happening. And if women don't have access to basic hygiene products or water, how can they ever deal with things such as this while having to simultaneously care for their children and think about what is going to be on the table for food in the next day? And actually, recently, with the government we currently have, there was a law project that was vetoed by the president of Brazil. This law project planned to give hygiene products for women for free and distribute them. It was proposed by women in Brazil in the Congress, and it was vetoed, which generated, a big movement, and we managed to get the veto down. I was there when it happened, but there's still a lot that needs to happen for this project to actually be in place. It's hard to get things moving with the government we currently have. We have a ministry for women, family, and human rights, but the minister for it is against major women rights movements. So there's a lot we need to do in the next years. So as you mentioned, that the government in Brazil is changing, and we do have a more progressive government coming, but there's still a lot that we need to focus on and fight. For the first time, we see that this agreement agreed that there is a connection with gender justice and climate change. And we need to take these policies now and take them to these leaders. Here at COP, we're seeing for the first time that some Brazilian youth is actually being heard, but there's still so much we need to do regionally and as a global community. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amalia. And I think it was very important that you stated the role of women in Congress when there was the talk about the free menstrual hygiene. It just also still takes us back to the point that Tara raised, the point that Mia also raised about how the meaningful representation of women and girls in their diversity in these spaces, these decision-making spaces. Because if we don't have the representation, then how will we have voices that will push for decisions that favor women and girls, for decisions that will push us closer to achieving gender equality in general. And so I just want to then open the floor. We've heard a lot from our panelists. We know there are also gender, climate change enthusiasts, advocates, activists, experts that are here. So perhaps if you have questions for any of our panelists at all, or you have your experiences that you want to share from your context, so this is a time to feel free to let us know if you want to contribute to any of this. You can always please mention your name and the organization that you represent when you want to give a question or comment. So the floor is open. Yeah. Could you raise your hand again so that we get the mic to you? Thank you. Thank you. Your name, the organization, and your question or comment.
Hello. So good afternoon, everyone. This is Amal Sara from Pakistan, and I am representing the Anglican Consultative Council and the Church of Pakistan at COP27. It was a wonderful session, and I have also been to CSW66 and 65 last year, but I attended virtually. I think the condition that you were mentioning in Brazil is so similar in Pakistan, and I can relate that. I don't have a question, but I have a situation like that because in Pakistan, women are so energetic. They want to do something. But whenever it comes in terms of decision making, whenever it comes for them to come up, there are always restrictions. Because in Pakistan, women talking about issues, they are not considered very appropriate, and they are not encouraged much. There are very few women like me or like other literate women who have the chance to speak about them. So yes, this is very true. If they are not even given the basic rights, how can they speak? And I think women are very powerful. So it's a need that their basic rights should be fulfilled so that they can bring a change, because women are change makers. If a woman can give birth, she can change everything. She has the power. So thank you, panelists. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. We have someone else here.
Thank you. I'm Neema from Ujamaa Community Resource Team. I like just to share the experience of the pastoralism, hunter-gatherer, and the agro-pastoralism, which we are working with. It is almost similar from the other countries that are here. The pastoralism women are totally not given the chance as women, like being part of decision-making bodies, owning land. So what we did as UCRT, we see that there is a need of indigenous women, especially those who are living in rural areas, also to be part and parcel of understanding the gender issue. Especially we did advocating women's rights, that they totally don't know their right. So we have to formulate what we call women rights and leadership forums as a platform we use in our villages to advocate women. Tell indigenous women in rural areas that you have right to own the land. You have right to be in different structure within the bodies in the villages. Like they don't even want to contest to be a village leader. They don't want to be in different committee. So even the traditional system of managing their natural resources, they totally exclude women. But as UCRT, we see the women are very strong. They can do something. So we see there is a gap. So after formulation of what we call land use plan, where now we secure the ancestral land for pastoralism, as their mostly life depend on land. So the most livelihood of them depend on land. So after securing the land, we say formulation of different committee, we have to consider the inclusion of women. So in any committee, if it is a grazing committee, land use planning committee, we have to ensure women are part and parcel of the committee so that they can also advocate women's rights. But also we have to advocate girls' rights. Girls are not given a chance to go to school. Girls are just get earlier marriage, as others colleagues say. So they have right to go to school. They have right to be a good mothers later. So how can they be the good mothers of the family while they don't go to school? So after formulating the forums, we have seen there are some changes that occur in the grassroots. Like we see some women have now become village chairs, something which is not normal in our traditional. We have now the village chairs called in one of the village called Muswakini. It really impressed the community. They try to use all the means that stop. How can you stand up contesting a certain position of a man? You are a woman. You don't support to contest. So they use many ways to try to tell her to not come up. But we appreciate the lady that she can and she win the position. So what I'm saying as a rural woman from the very local environment, that let not leave women behind. Women can as men can. Let us stop gender-based violence. We have to speak, especially advocate right to women. We have to include them in all structure, either governance, either natural resource benefit sharing, community-based tourism, any kind. What I believe that women can only be valued and respected if they earn something within the family. So we have to empower them economically so that they can also be respected. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have more hands here. Your name and organization, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Gregory Spira. I'm with CARE Canada. And I just want to start out by sharing my disappointment that there are not more individuals in this room who identify as men. I am a gender champion. I serve as head of gender, food, and climate justice programs at CARE Canada. And we are directly trying to do what Tara, you were saying, is integrating SRHR into our various program areas. It's not easy, and especially on the agriculture and food systems front, we're seeing a lot of success because there's a recognition of the intertwined nature of women's agricultural livelihoods and their sexual reproductive health and rights. So my question for you is, how do we take that integrated approach to scale and convince donors, for example, of the relevance? Because I think if we only focus on SRHR over here in climate change and over there food systems or economic development or, we're not going to get anywhere. So how do we push that integration further? Thank you.
All right, great. We'll take, yeah, there's a hand behind. Or I think yours was, yeah, you first and then we go behind, yes. Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. I am Maria Elena. I'm an independent consultant for the UN. I would like to ask the representative from Brazil. You mentioned the importance of addressing the intersectional approach in order to identify inequalities faced by women in this framework of a crisis due to climate change. I would like to ask you, how do you think, do you have data, do you have information, do you have empirical background in order to know how this climate change is affecting especially women, in the case of Brazil, black women, but also indigenous women in the region, and how the policies are confronting these issues? Are they tackling this issue of intersectional kind of discrimination, inequalities? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Are there more hands? Okay.
Good afternoon, all. I share with my sister from Brazil. I feel your passion, and I feel you for the work you're doing. And it's not different from where I come from. My name is Juliana Agema. I work with Women Environmental Program in Nigeria. And a lot of these happen even when you try so hard for your voice to be heard. It's as if it's just a drop in an ocean. So, but just to encourage you that you still need to do more. You're not just doing it alone. You need to get other women also with you, other girls with you. You need to start mentoring them also. You need to start from the grassroots, mentoring girls so that they'll know all these issues so that they can begin to fight for their rights. Because it's very, very important that, that we need our voices to be heard. And if we don't work towards that, in the next 20 years, in the next 5 years, we will not have anyone to take over from us. If we keep coming here, we the older ones, we keep coming out and talking and then leaving the young ones behind, then it's not going to help us. So we need to start a mentorship program from the grassroots, start teaching the girls how to speak, start teaching them how to fight for their rights, teaching them to go out there and defend their rights for themselves. We started a mentorship program. For the past 2 years, we were mentoring young women. Every month we have them, teach them skills. We let them know that it's not just you going to school. You still need to learn skills. You need to learn something to do with your hands for yourself. Because if you go to school, you come out, there are no jobs for you. So what do? You can't sit around and wait for yourself. You need to do something for yourself. So we need to start a mentorship program for young girls so that we can begin to teach them from the grassroots what to do. So that tomorrow, if we start with one, by tomorrow we might have millions of girls who are out there speaking and fighting for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing that intergenerational, intersectional approach to fore, because I think that's extremely important in all that we're saying, developing the power within, because it's until the power within is developed, like our participant said, from the grassroots level, how then do people exercise their rights when they're not even aware of these rights and their existence? So if you can take on one more person before I then take it back to the panel. Okay, go.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a part of the delegation from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a young feminist activist from the Caribbean, so I really connect with what you're saying, Amalia, as someone from Latin America. You know, we have that shared lived experience of a lack of recognition of women's involvement in the climate movements, and our governments can tend to glaze over the importance of gender-responsive climate policies. So it was really nice to hear you speak about that. And then I heard a question come up about if we have data to support our claims, and that's a really big problem that we have in the feminist movement back home, where there's a lack of gender disaggregated data. There's a lack of push by governments to listen to the lived experience of young women and young Indigenous people who are experts in their own experience with climate injustice. So I really wanted to say thank you to all of you, because this has been so educational. I've really enjoyed this panel. And then to just reiterate the point that was made earlier, that I failed to see the recognition of women's rights at COP this year, and that's been something that's really disappointing to me. I bring to mind that image that we saw in the first week of all those world leaders, I think 110, and only 7 of them were women. So I'm so glad for you. I'm so thankful for you all for holding this space today. I'm so grateful for it. This was actually one of the sessions I was most looking forward to. And I hope to connect with you all later. Yeah, my only question though, sorry to ramble on so much, but how can we as young activists from the Caribbean, from Latin America, get involved in the global movements connecting climate and gender justice? Thank you.
All right, so we have a question for Tara, we have one for Amelia, and then we have a general question that anyone can take on. So Amelia or Tara, who wants to go first?
Thanks, Amelia. So I'm going to tackle this question of what do we do? How do we take this integration further? How do we get this recognition that we so need in this space? And I want to think about it in 2 ways. First is there is this general kind of normative shift that has happened, where there's this recognition that gender equality is necessary for effective climate action, that gender should be mainstreamed across all climate action. But we're still having to do so much work as advocates to talk about what that really means and what that really looks like. And I think part of this is us introducing into that narrative that SRHR is a fundamental part of that gender mainstreaming, that we cannot have gender equality without full recognition of SRHR, full realization of SRHR, and to build that into our messages when we're starting to talk about gender and climate change. And then I also see that there are 2 particular kind of potential entry points and anchors within the climate space right now that I hope that we can take better advantage of. One is health. We have seen, unfortunately, that there's a lack of recognition of health impacts overall in the convention. But we fundamentally want to talk about and discuss SRHR as healthcare, as a full range of health services, as pre- and postnatal care, comprehensive sexuality education, family planning, services for gender-based violence, as well as services for the screening of cervical cancer or sexually transmitted infections. There's a full range of SRHR needs across the entire life course that I think that we sometimes fail to really detail and say that this is what we mean when we're talking about the healthcare. And so I think the storytelling that we also are starting to see about what happens in disasters and how SRHR services are absolutely the first that we lose access to is really necessary for us building this fuller picture. And I want to go back to something Amelia said earlier, of this understanding that, of course, communities recognize these interlinkages because they're living them. And so I do want to bring back this idea that we, as advocates and as the people that are privileged enough to be in these particular international policy spaces, have an obligation to bring forth the stories of what is happening in local communities and to help amplify and share those stories. And particularly with regards to the impacts that we're seeing on health. I think the second entry point that I'll just touch on briefly is that there is this recognition when we are talking about gender equality that there's a discussion about women's leadership, women's agency, women leading on solutions, and that's a very accepted narrative within the climate space now. That's something else that we can build on, because you cannot fully have agency if you do not have bodily autonomy. You cannot fully achieve this gender equality, this level of participation and leadership that sometimes becomes prized and really valued and talked about in a very general or even a reductionist way in this space without having bodily autonomy. So I really want us to think about how we can use various entry points to try and make the case that we need to continue making in these spaces. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. Health and equal, meaningful representation and participation. Amelia, over to you.
Yeah, I think I want to answer the question. I also want to comment on the other question and what was said. I think there are still very few there's still few data on intersectionality of climate and gender. We can't find a lot of research on how women in particularly are affected by these disasters. But what can be said is a couple of things. That we do know, for example, that in Brazil there are high numbers of feminicide. And this happens usually in regions where there is not a lot of, first of all, education, there isn't a lot of healthcare, there isn't a lot of access by public policies. What we can also say is that marginalized communities in Brazil are usually in more climate vulnerable places. Favelas are usually on mountains or high levels that are really vulnerable to rains and sliding. Indigenous communities, rural communities, which was talked about, are usually really close to big farmers and in places that are also very affected by droughts, floods, and such. When these disasters affect these areas, it is a lot harder for these communities to deal with than for the big farmers. And inside these communities, like I mentioned before, women are doing a lot of key roles, both inside houses, in families, but also sometimes in leadership roles in these communities. We see a lot of indigenous leaders doing a lot of change, but they are directly affected when they have to deal with these attacks and with these disasters in their communities. So unfortunately, there is little data that we can show that relates these issues, but if we look at the separate data and realize that it's happening in the same places, we can link it and take a look at it intersectionally for ourselves, even if the research is not that. I want to talk a little bit more about also climate education, which was mentioned a lot. I think that through education, we can really empower women. A lot of women don't know what rights they have. That was said, that is true also, and we see that in Brazil as well. They don't know what rights they have, and they don't know also a lot of information that could keep them safe. In Brazil, for example, we happen to have a really good healthcare system, though it does not provide some healthcare for women. I believe there is access to, for example, the pills. for contraceptives. Yes, we do have access for that for free, and we need to educate women so they know that they should go after that and they should take that because, for example, in my country it happens to be available, but there's still little knowledge on that. And when we empower women, when we show them and educate them from childhood, we see that what they do in the future is amazing because women are really powerful. And when the ownership of our bodies is given back to us, when we take it back, I think a really powerful thing happens, and that's what we need to push for. And I guess as activists, we need to be in these spaces making sure that this is happening and pushing for this action. We need to push for the intersectional research. We need to push for the policies to actually happen. And we need to push for recognition that these issues are interconnected. And I guess the only way we can actually do that is connecting with each other and talking with each other and going after these people as a community.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I think you've also touched on the question on young activists and global activism in general on the intersection. I wonder if any of us have more to comment?
So I actually just also wanted to touch a little on the donor part. I think we have the huge body of evidence to show this interconnectedness, right? So I think we need to also see how do we, the silos that are there also is also how these funding structures are. And I think that needs to be also broken in a way that, the funding structures also need to take into account that, those silos that is already there are not further exacerbated. And when you are talking about SRHR, you really cannot discuss or you really cannot resolve the issues of SRHR without actually talking about the intersections around it, right? So that's something there. Just on the Pakistan also, Arrow has also done a study on the intersections of climate change and SRHR in Pakistan, and we have studies from Sindh province. So if you actually are interested, we can talk about it later. But it has shown how the social cultural norms and practices have inhibited women to actually seek services, especially sexual and reproductive health and rights services, because they are not allowed, and especially in the camps, in disaster camps, because they are not allowed to go out without the company of a man. So these kind of practices also hinders the access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And also we had such a huge, Pakistan just went through a huge disasters and no one is asking what is the sexual and reproductive health and situations in the country, right? So we need to ask these right questions, and we need to ask women what they are going through. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in order, in terms of what we are asking when as well, and also in response to how to connect. Maybe the first step is really to join the SRHR and CJ coalition. So maybe you can talk to us after this and we can let you know how to join the coalition.
For me. So thank you so much for raising that part about the linkages between food systems, land rights, and Indigenous women and sexual SRHR. Most of the people that I spoke to at the policy making level, they do not understand how malnutrition because of being dispossessed of lands can affect the health of women and the newborn, the children. So these policies on land rights, this policy on land use, food systems are not coherent enough. And this is something that we must address as well. I just wanted to share this really interesting initiative in Malaysia where governments are really slow and the communities are moving faster because they are the ones that are being impacted. They are at the front lines. So women, when being empowered, when they are empowered, they are forced to reckon with. So there is this indigenous corporation of Indigenous women in Malaysia that attempts to change the narrative of sustainable consumption, whereby they sell their food produce to supermarkets who support the narrative of a sustainable consumption in terms of using organic material, organic ways of cultivating and farming. So these community, this group of women, they wanted to change the way how people see food, how people relate to food, where food is being sourced. They want people to care about food. So imagine the kind of the kind of education, the kind of knowledge that they have, and they want to impart it to the others through the education of food system. So it was a really wonderful initiative being done, and it can be scaled up. I think so far right now it is being financed by UNDP, and I really do hope that the other communities can learn from them, and they are doing a lot of community dialogues and trying to share what they have learned by creating their own local economies when the big farmers are ignoring to buy their produce. So it was a really empowering story for me. Yeah.
Thank you. And yes, I also just quickly want to reiterate what has also been said by multiple people here on stage, but also down at the audience, that women are actually powerful agents of change, because we have a habit of talking about women in the climate spaces as vulnerable to the climate crisis, which is most definitely true, but they're also very crucial to make powerful and sustainable climate action, so they're just as much agents of change as they are vulnerable to the climate crisis. That's also something that we need to have more reflected in these intergovernmental spaces, that is as of now more focused on women being vulnerable and not as much as women being agents of change. It's also something that we see on national level, that the countries with higher shares of women in government actually tend to adopt more ambitious, more sustainable climate action policies and programs. So I just think that's a very, very important point that's also being shared here today.
Thank you, Maya, for reminding us of that and bringing that to the forefront of the narrative. So I'll just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. We know there are several side events happening at the same time, but you chose to spend the time here with us. And then we hope that, our panelists have shared how sexual reproductive health and rights intersect with the climate crisis, and how it is very important that sexual reproductive health and rights, which basically we're saying women and girls in their diversity being able to access healthcare, being able to make decisions over their body, and also freedom from violence, how that is very crucial to adaptation and resilience when it comes to the idea of climate action being gender transformative. And then we hope that we've shared some of these ways it intersects with you, and that you take it on your work, your advocacy, in programs, in policy, in implementation, and hopefully we have more men on board, like he said, to continue to advocate and push for this action forward, so that perhaps in more intergovernmental decisions to come, COP28, CSW67, however that we have it, some of these diverse decisions, that we see conclusions that are truly gender transformative, and then we see this happen in real life, because the true essence of when we have all of these huge decisions, if it does not translate into meaningful impact for women and girls at community level, at rural, indigenous, at just existing in their everyday life, then it doesn't bring much more meaning to the conversation we are having in global spaces like this. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your sessions.